The United States, from its inception, was defined by an ideological aversion to foreign entanglements. It was a group of nations which, from the start, wanted to govern themselves and separate from the cost and political baggage of European imperial conflicts. The cornerstone of American foreign policy throughout its early life was laid by George Washington's farewell address in 1796. He famously warned against permanent alliances with foreign nations, stating that the United States ought to instead pursue peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. The Washington doctrine of unstable alliances was not merely something of his personal preference, but an assessment of America's geopolitical reality. A fledgling nation with vast natural resources, protected by 2 oceans, and capable of self-sufficiency. This stance was echoed by his successors. John Adams refused to help France during the Quasi-War, and Thomas Jefferson made plenty of promises against foreign entanglement. The War of 1812, America's last major conflict with a European power for many decades thereafter, further solidified the American belief that entanglements only brought unnecessary war and destruction to their way of life. Even the Monroe Doctrine, while often misinterpreted as an early sign of American interventionism, was originally a defensive measure. In practice, the doctrine was largely rhetorical, as the United States, since Jefferson's anti-naval policies, lacked the fleet power to enforce it. But even with internal conflicts, like the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, the United States remained staunchly isolationist regarding European affairs. As the British and French engaged in imperial conflicts in Africa, India, and Asia, and Germany began its ascent, America largely refrained from military engagements abroad, simply utilizing Europe as a market for export. When European wars broke out, American leaders consistently ignored them. Even the Spanish-American War, which is the best argument that America was indeed transforming into an interventionist power by the turn of the 20th century, remained an isolated regional affair in the Americas and the Pacific, which America exerted great influence over since its acquisition of Hawaii, and was driven by a class of American politicians who would end up forming the political minority in favor of American support for Britain during the First World War. Now, World War I marked the first full-scale rupture in the United States' non-interventionist tradition. Initially, even Woodrow Wilson, who was a product of and a manifestation of the same impulses that dragged America into the Spanish-American War, maintained neutrality, while the European powers, many of whom were even major trade partners of the United States, descended into conflict. The war was widely viewed by Americans as, of course, a European affair, unworthy of American sacrifice. Wilson's 1916 re-election campaign was built on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." However, several factors, German unrestricted submarine warfare, the sinking of the Lusitania, and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, gradually pulled the United States towards intervention. In April 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war, framing the conflict as a fight to make the world safe for democracy. This huge rhetorical shift was the signal flare of a departure from neutrality towards moralistic interventionism. The war and its end caused a boom and bust cycle in the American economy, which resulted in the stock market crash of 1928 and the Great Depression, both of which contributed to the factors that wrought the rise of fascism in Italy and National Socialism in Germany, along with Wilson's post-war ambitions, embodied in the League of Nations and his quite unevenly spread mandate of self-determinism, which created the mutilated victory in Italy with the formation of the eternally unstable Yugoslav state, and the creation of unstable nationalist states across Europe who were left to fend for themselves as the European empires were forced to retreat into a rebuilding process. Yet even as Wilson messed up Europe and the Middle East, his League of Nations project was ultimately rejected by the American public and the Senate, who were still within this anti-foreign intervention paradigm, and even viewed the First World War as simply an exception which proved this rule. Americans overwhelmingly embraced a return to non-interventionism in the 1920s and 1930s, passing the Neutrality Acts, partially due to the economic situation, but also simply this framework against entanglement that had been there since the Revolution in the 18th century. Even the outbreak of World War II in 1939 was met with overwhelming public opposition to intervention. Hitler's armies swept across Europe and Britain, whom the United States was very close with. Yet President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced significant domestic opposition to aiding the Allies. The America First Committee, led by Charles Lindbergh, was incredibly popular and supported this widespread belief that foreign wars should not dictate American policy. Yet Roosevelt still pursued a policy of the arsenal of democracy aid programs, culminating in the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. This much was already somewhat unpopular, but the calculus changed with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which decisively ended American isolationism. Once the war had ended, Britain, though victorious, was economically shattered, unable to maintain its empire, and more importantly, its global influence as a power broker and the world police of sorts, enforcing the concert order built by Metternich. The United States, for better or for worse, filled the vacuum. The Bretton Woods system, the establishment of the United Nations, the Open Society Project, American support for Zionism, the reconstruction of Japan, and the Marshall Plan all signaled that the United States was no longer a reluctant bystander, but now the global hegemon. And attitudes at home, slowly, were shifted by years of public campaigns to present any threat to American dominance over Europe and the broader world as a threat to America itself. The post-war period, of course, saw the rise of two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Even though the Soviet Union posed no direct threat to the United States, it did not have the capabilities or the incentive to invade the mainland United States, and it didn't have a nuclear arsenal yet that could threaten America, and it couldn't even hurt the American economy or the people who lived in the United States herself. The ideological family tree of Marxism, of which communism was a product, posed a threat to both the American political landscape, due to the concept of a global revolution, and then also America's allies, or by this point, her economic proxies in Europe and Asia, as communism slowly spread from the Soviet Union across these continents. Thus, by the 1952 presidential election between Adlai Stevenson and Dwight D. Eisenhower, America's popular view of foreign entanglement saw a decisive shift away from anti-interventionism and towards the containment of communism by any means necessary. The Korean War became America's first major post-war intervention, setting a precedent for Cold War military engagements. Vietnam soon followed, with disastrous consequences. The ideological rationale of containing communism led to interventions in Latin America, the Middle East, and beyond. From Iraq to Afghanistan, the US has since been engaged in continuous warfare since the Cold War's inception. And while framed as necessary for security, democracy, and nation building, these interventions have eroded America's reputation, destabilized entire regions, crushed ancient cultures, and ripped the United States away from the foundation of its inception, self-sufficiency and self-government, and towards this bleak modern identity of the reluctant empire. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the United States returned to the policy of anti-interventionism immediately following the end of the Second World War? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion like our current channel members, Eaglefall, Derek Arno Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Stratocrat, Daniel Andrulis, and Lekness. Thank you, and enjoy the video. Let's start by assuming that the anti-interventionist policies begin during Truman's administration, right after the end of the war in both the Pacific and European theaters. This much is pretty unrealistic. Truman was very pro-intervention and was really the creator of the policy of containment of communism. But nonetheless, we'll just wave our magic wand here and say that somehow he becomes anti-interventionist just as soon as the Axis capitulate. While the United States would provide economic aid to Europe through what we might see, a modified Marshall Plan, perhaps with less strings attached and more as a means to rebuild American markets abroad, it would forego direct military occupation, leaving the stabilization of post-war Germany to Britain and to France. With France itself quite devastated, the burden of post-war reconstruction would fall even more disproportionately upon the British, who, financially crippled, would already lack the resources and manpower to effectively manage both Germany and their existing global empire, let alone the homeland. The result would be a more chaotic and protracted post-war settlement in Europe, with Britain struggling to contain Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe while simultaneously maintaining its colonial holdings, many of whom already had fostered nationalist movements, some of which would later be backed by the Soviets. The lack of direct American presence in Western Europe would probably prevent the rise of the NATO alliance, bringing with it a more fragmented Western response to Soviet influence. Without American occupying forces in Germany, Britain would likely enforce a stricter deindustrialization policy in line with the original Morgenthau Plan, splitting the part of Germany not occupied by the Soviets into an international zone and a South German state. The so-called international zone would evolve into a state which we'll just call Saxony for the sake of simplicity, which will be guided into an economic and security partnership with Britain, France, and other Western European nations, though likely finding itself heavily economically dependent upon the British. Meanwhile, a South German state, which we'll just call Bavaria, might find itself drifting towards a more democratic socialist model, distinct from Soviet communism, yet removed from the Anglo-French sphere. Unlike Saxony, which would remain staunchly Western aligned, Bavaria would be much more self-sufficient and in a stronger post-war position simply by circumstance, which would allow it to carve out an independent course, probably ending up like Yugoslavia, in that it would find itself in a non-aligned state in the European Cold War. In Asia, however, the United States would inevitably take a more active role, but only in Japan. Unlike in our timeline, where Japan was rebuilt as a vital US ally and, more importantly, a military foothold against communism in Korea and China, in this scenario, the occupation would be more economically driven. Without America jumping into a war in Korea, the United States would not prioritize rapid reindustrialization and militarization of the Japanese archipelago, which would probably lead to a bit of a slower recovery for Japan, but it would still be one that would lead it to be an economic superpower by the late 20th century, simply given the power of US investment and Japan's position in this post-war world. Now, the absence of American intervention in Korea and political intervention in China would only accelerate Chiang Kai-shek's government's defeat in the Chinese Civil War. Beset by corruption, warlordism, and facing a powerful communist opposition, the nationalists would in fact collapse, allowing Maoist China to rise, possibly even holding Taiwan as well. Now, this would bring about a communist victory in Korea in addition, leading to a unified Soviet-aligned Korean peninsula, setting a precedent that the United States would not intervene in foreign countries in response to the expansion of communism, something that would factor into the Soviet foreign policy calculus. But Stalin, ever paranoid, would probably not cool down Soviet animosity towards the United States, even with this situation, instead viewing American non-interventionism in Europe and Korea as a sign of weakness rather than goodwill. However, over time, as the United States continues to focus solely on economic development and withdraws from global commitments, the ideological rhetoric of American imperialism would lose its potency in Soviet propaganda. With no NATO to unite Western Europe under a single military umbrella, and no American bases encircling the USSR in Korea, in Japan, etc., Stalin would have less of a reason to aggressively expand Soviet influence. He may even become more focused on consolidating control over the Eastern Bloc rather than seeking further confrontation. Now, with that being said, Stalin's inherent distrust of capitalism and democracy would ensure that the United States and USSR wouldn't still really be on good terms, though they might not end up in a nuclear Cold War. We might even see this animosity manifest itself more in economic competition and technological innovation, as it had under Kennedy with the space race. It's hard to predict. But one thing for certain, though, would be that Western European states in Britain, France, Scandinavia, Francoist Spain, and Salazar's Portugal would all see the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc as even more of an existential threat. And furthermore, at least for the democratic nations in this group, they would see America as having betrayed their cause. This might force these powers to forge their own military alliance, something like an earlier manifestation of the European coal and steel community, an economic alliance built to keep Western European economies strong in the face of communism, and create a framework to assist each other in maintaining their colonial empires and stability at home. Spain and Portugal, and their economic miracles around the late 50s, might even make more corporatist or technocratic economic reforms, particularly with a tilt towards the self-sufficiency of Western Europe against the world, more appealing. Though we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. For the sake of our scenario, we'll assume that Adlai Stevenson wins the election of 1952, further cementing this non-interventionist shift. Stevenson would be an interesting change. He was an anti-interventionist, but he wasn't one in the same sense as the more isolation-prone of the previous decades. But he was a strict opponent of American power projection abroad. He was kind of an interesting deal. He was a proponent of the United Nations and would probably oversee an American foreign policy geared towards détente with the Soviet Union and a more diplomatic opposition to war in general. In spite of his more egalitarian views towards war and diplomacy, Stevenson was not an egalitarian himself, and would likely end whatever European aid and recovery programs still might exist by the mid-1950s, leaving Britain and France to fend for themselves. Without continued American financial and military backing, Britain's global commitments would become even more unsustainable, accelerating the decline of its empire. France would also be struggling with uprisings in Indochina and Algeria, and without Stevenson's United States providing material or logistical support to its colonial wars, it would be in an even worse position. We might see France simply begin to engage in bloodier colonial wars that would wear away at what economy it had mustered since the end of the war, and likely an earlier Fifth Republic under what might be a de Gaulle more emboldened by partnership with Spain and Portugal. Meanwhile, the British Crown might provide royal assent to bills sanctioning the peaceful independence of a swath of its colonies in Africa, as it had done with India and Pakistan in 1947. We'd probably see a strategy wherein the British cut off the more costly colonies and maintain certain profitable or resource-rich economies to keep the cost of manufacturing in the Isles from rising too high, with Malaya, Singapore, Kenya, and even smaller but resource-rich colonies like Sierra Leone and the Gambia becoming the new stars of the empire, so to speak, in the wake of the exit of the Raj. Still, the economic exhaustion, no matter how steady of a recovery trajectory Britain could embark upon, along with nationalist movements in some of the colonies, would keep Britain from rising back into the position of comfort and security for the time being. Now at home, Stevenson's policies would focus on domestic economic stability, likely heavily cutting back on military spending. This could also result in a halt to nuclear weapons programs, with Stevenson, who was a proponent of disarmament, pushing for a UN treaty heavily limiting nuclear weapons stockpiles and programs across the world. Stalin would probably not be inclined to sign this treaty, though if the US did sign it under Stevenson, there would be no need for Stalin to invest so much in a nuclear weapons program, and thus, this could easily reduce the nuclear panic and perhaps even pave the way for a more accepting culture towards nuclear energy in the United States, and even in Western Europe. Without the arms race of the Eisenhower years, the US economy would find itself in a much more stable, steady growth, retaining its manufacturing industries, probably passing pro-union legislation, and without as entrenched a military-industrial lobby. We wouldn't see the same fervor of McCarthyism, but we also might not experience the same American optimism of the 50s. As the 1950s continue, we would enter a more multipolar world order, something more natural than the American hegemony of our history. The United States would remain economically dominant in the world, but politically very restrained, limiting its influence to select partnerships with basically just Britain and Japan. This new era of splendid isolation would allow the US to maintain its manufacturing base, avoiding the mass deindustrialization that would later hollow out the Rust Belt in our timeline. With the absence of the Eisenhower highway system, given Eisenhower's defeat, America probably wouldn't transform into a car-dependent society, with cities continuing their reliance on streetcars and rail infrastructure, fostering a denser, more transit-oriented American cityscape along the East Coast, with the rail infrastructure that stretched across the heartland being maintained, especially since it has to support the manufacturing base that has also been maintained. Now that said, the automobile industry would remain important, but it wouldn't reshape the country to the same degree as in our own history. Another effect of specifically Stevenson's administration would come in the form of a different civil rights movement. The civil rights movement of this timeline would probably take on a quieter, more legislative path, with the Democratic Party of Stevenson pushing through civil rights reforms without the spectacle, but also without the speed of reform as in our own history. Stevenson believed in gradual, decisive reforms, which he thought would rip away the inequalities of segregation but prevent racial tensions from escalating. Back across the Atlantic, Western Europe would of course have no military shield from the Americas, and would thus probably evolve their existing cooperation into a full-fledged military alliance, led by the British, the French, and perhaps the Spanish too, who in this timeline would be closer with de Gaulle and would not be isolated from European affairs out of a sheer necessity to have as many allies as possible in the West's neighborhood. Now this military alliance would come to encompass Saxony, Portugal, Italy, the Benelux nations, and eventually probably Austria, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and out of convenience Denmark. This in turn could either solidify Bavaria's diplomatic isolation, with its politics arousing suspicion, though it could just as easily be integrated into this bloc. But this alliance wouldn't do much to prevent the stress countries like Britain and Portugal would feel with their colonial commitments, and also the grueling task of long-term economic recovery, which would still be an issue by the late 50s. Britain would probably experience an intensifying labor movement, though one that, in true British fashion, would integrate itself into the political process rather than violently clashing with the establishment as it might in other Western European countries. We could then easily see a more socialized Britain, ironically enough, in this timeline. France, however, would take a different path. With de Gaulle steering the ship, France would probably align itself closely with Francoist Spain, forming a bulwark against leftist agitation and anti-colonial insurgencies, with intelligence sharing agreements between France and Spain and probably Portugal in order to crack down on leftist resistance and also anti-colonial resistance. Now, this support for strongmanism could spill over into Italy and Austria, though Italy in particular would lack the popular support for a full-scale return to something akin to Mussolini-era policies, as evidenced by the 1948 elections wherein a neo-fascist party won only 2% of the vote. Now, with the Soviet Union unchallenged in its immediate sphere, feeling secure in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, Khrushchev, once he succeeded Stalin in 1958, would be in an even better position than in our own history to implement the reformist agenda he had planned. Rather than expending resources on futile Cold War proxy conflicts, the USSR could turn its focus inward, modernizing its economy and softening Stalin-era repressions. Khrushchev would probably begin to integrate further into the United Nations system, and Moscow would see no reason to support communists in Latin America with such a Soviet-American détente. In this less bipolar world, Mao will be forced to position China as a more independent power, bringing on an earlier Sino-Soviet split. Korea, too, would follow a different path. Without the Korean War bombings destroying the North's manufacturing base, and without isolation against Western influence defining its development, this united Korea would not become a hermit kingdom. Instead, it would probably parallel China under Deng Xiaoping, pursuing whatever economic policy was most pragmatic for its own growth, while maintaining an aesthetic of socialism. Vietnam, likewise, would undergo a transformation with the earlier unification under the communists. The Viet Cong were actually primarily nationalists rather than staunch ideologues, and they were barely even Marxist in terms of economic policy. Once they had consolidated their rule in the South, the Viet Cong would probably see little benefit in aligning too closely with China, who had historically been a threat to even the Nguyen dynasty of Vietnam. Vietnam would thus probably follow a similar geopolitical trajectory as they had in our own history just decades earlier, and they might even align with the Japanese if they see China as too threatening to remain a non-aligned power. Speaking of Japan, the Japanese economy would continue to surge, cementing its position as the leading power in the East. With strong US backing and no major conflicts derailing its trajectory, Japan would experience the same emergence of a technological and industrial dominance in the East, rivaling the US economy in the coming decades. By contrast, China under Mao would deeply struggle to modernize. Without the Soviet Union's unwavering support and with the United States more interested in Japan as a partner in Asia, China's economy would just continue to fall into more disrepair. Mao's rigid economic policies will inevitably lead to stagnation until Deng Xiaoping can take control, though he will have an even more difficult time in pulling China out of economic collapse than in our own timeline, as the United States would have no interest in exporting its manufacturing economy abroad to China and other Asian nations. And we're left then with a world in a much more multipolar order as we rise into the 70s and 80s, free from the edge that the unusual circumstances of the Cold War duopoly and post-Cold War monopoly of world power brought us in our own history. The next questions, decolonization, European Federation, Soviet liberalization, and the likely rise of China and India to counterbalance Japanese and American economic dominance will be the main questions for the world to answer moving forward. So let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.